Good morning and welcome to the NATO Association of Canada's Climate Solutions Advancement and Advancement Networks Media Advisory event, Climate Change and Human Security, What Can Be Done? My name is David Collinet and I'm chair of the NATO Association of Canada, a charitable NGO devoted to educating Canadians about the importance of NATO and the international rules-based order. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that our association is based in Toronto, the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, as well as home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. It's my pleasure today to introduce our moderator, Dr. Sweta Chakraborty, who is a globally recognized risk and behavioral scientist and expert on global risks ranging from climate change to COVID-19. She's a trusted authority on proactive preparedness to mitigate against the impacts of climate change, motivated by the need for clear, credible, evidence-based communication. She's regularly interviewed in global news media like on CNN, the BBC, and she's an author from her time as a postdoctoral fellow at Oxford University. She's a TEDx and SXSW speaker and was recently featured on Discovery Plus alongside United States Vice President Kamala Harris on the topic of climate and security. Dr. Chakraborty is currently the United States representative for We Don't Have Time, the world's largest climate action network based in Sweden. She will be overseeing and heading up the operations in the US. Dr. Chakraborty, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Honorable David Collinet. And in a moment, I will introduce our panel of speakers. But just before I do, I have a couple of pieces of housekeeping that we should get out of the way. So first, everyone in the audience, please do mute your microphone so we can hear each speaker and we don't pick up any distracting feedback. And we ask that speakers please stay muted and off video until it's your specific turn to present. We'll be devoting about 15 or 20 minutes at the end of this presentation for audience questions, and you're invited to type them into the chat at any time. Please also make sure you note your name, the name of your organization, and the speaker that you're addressing your question to, or if it's more than one speaker, that's fine as well. We'll do our best to get to all of the questions during the Q&A. This is all time permitting. So we invite you to share what's happening here today on social media. Please use the hashtag ClimateSAN. That's SAN following climate. We're really excited to announce that today's event is the prelude to a larger conference on the impact of climate on human security. And it's scheduled for May 18th and 19th. You'll be hearing more about that at the end of our session today. So without any further delay, let me introduce you to our first speaker, Paul Stevers. Paul Stevers is the president of Think Renewables Group and co-founder of ClimateSAN. He's an engineer by training. Paul began his career focused on environmental-based business technologies, including a new medical waste processing technology that he developed. Following the tragic events of September 11th in 2001, Paul became increasingly interested in the role of technologies and renewable resources and what they could play in stabilizing conflict zones around the world, initially focusing on Afghanistan and eventually expanding his work to include parts of Africa. In his role at ClimateSAN, Paul facilitates investment in solutions that mitigate climate change. So Paul, why are you and your team hosting this conference on climate security solutions and finance?
Well, thank you, Sweta. There's really four main reasons. The first is that the scientific evidence is indicating that the world is on a very dangerous warming trend. I mean, very dangerous. Second is that we feel that that very large-scale action is needed on a sustained basis to counter this trend, not just a one-year effort, but this is going to require many years. Fortunately, military and intelligence experts can help build broad-based support because they're uniquely positioned to speak out about the impacts of climate change on human security, which can help reach an audience that is often not taking the dangers of this climate change very seriously. Finally, we want to highlight how civil society can play an important role in helping building this broad-based support. At this conference, we're not only be discussing climate and security, but we'll also just outline climate solutions that can be implemented on a global scale and some very large climate finance initiatives. To quickly illustrate the evidence about dangerous warming trend that we are on, and also to show the world what it would look like if we not change course, I'm now going to show this 4-minute animated video.
The world is getting warmer and at an increasing rate. A large reason for this is CO2 levels in the atmosphere. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they have risen at an unprecedented rate. Rising CO2 levels have been correlating closely with rising global temperatures since 1880. This graph shows rising CO2 levels on a shorter timescale as measured at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. On an even shorter timescale, you can see average CO2 levels have continued to rise despite a global economic slowdown from the coronavirus pandemic, which is shown by the black line. The red line on this graph shows the seasonal variations. In 1990, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, published their first assessment report. They modeled a series of scenarios estimating the expected rise in CO2 levels. The business-as-usual case was deeply concerning. Fast forward to the panel's fifth report in 2014. In it, they referred to different scenarios called representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. The worst-case scenario, RCP 8.5, leads to a particularly grim result. Unfortunately, between 2005 and 2020, cumulative CO2 emissions have tracked within 1% of RCP 8.5. Without substantial action to reduce CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, we can expect to experience the worst-case scenario. Under this worst-case scenario, warming outcomes have been estimated to be approximately 4.5 degrees Celsius. This will likely lead to catastrophic results including crashing ecosystems, rapidly rising sea levels, and the forced migration of billions of people. To illustrate the kind of world we can expect if the temperature rises in the range of this amount, shown here is a short 2-minute video published by Sky News about the world if it warms up by 4 degrees Celsius.
After the collapse of the Amazon and the carbon cycle, stabilizing global temperatures to avoid a 4-degree increase may no longer be possible. The global stream of migrants, which started with those seeking food and water, now includes millions fleeing coastal areas. Cities there will either vanish or become islands. In this temperature range, ice at both poles is certain to vanish, causing an eventual rise in sea levels of 50 meters. This will take hundreds, perhaps even thousands of years, but a sea level rise of even 1 meter every 20 years is far beyond our capacity to adapt. One place where adaptation is critical is China. While most countries' emissions have been largely stable since the start of this century, China's have gone through the roof. Today, the country produces 28% of the world's rice, 24% of the world's maize, and 18% of its wheat. But in this future, Chinese agriculture crashes. The country needs to feed more than 1 billion people on 2/3 of its current harvest. Meanwhile, by this point, up to 85% of the Amazon rainforest has disappeared. Summers will be longer, with soaring temperatures turning forests into firewood. Southern Britain could reach 45 degrees Celsius. Air conditioning is mandatory, which in turn puts more stress on energy infrastructure. There's a spike in emissions as output from coal and gas power stations increases, as hydroelectric sources literally dry up and renewables fail to take up the slack. But the most damaging event at this temperature is the irreversible thaw of permafrost. At least 500 billion tons of carbon trapped below ground could be released by 2100. While no one has put a figure on the exact implications for global warming, the signs are ominous.
As you can see, the current path we are on is a pathway to disaster. To change course, the world needs to mobilize for action on climate change on a sufficiently large scale. In order to build broad-based support for this, we must bridge the gap between believers and doubters on the impacts of climate change. Military and intelligence experts are uniquely positioned to speak out about these impacts on human security to build more support for large-scale action on this issue. Engaging with civil society to develop strategies that enable everyone to benefit from implementing large-scale action is also key. Join us on May 18th and 19th at our conference to learn more. For more information, visit climatesan.org/CWT.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Paul. Our next speaker has actually been pre-recorded. He was not able to join us live today, but I'm thrilled to introduce Michael Klare. Michael Klare is a senior visiting fellow with the Arms Control Association and professor emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College. He is also the defense correspondent of the Nation magazine and author of numerous books, including All Hell Breaking Loose, The Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. Let's listen to what Michael has to share with us.
Pleasure to be with you today.
So you have so much expertise in this topic, and it's a real treat that our audience is able to be here to listen to you. We would love to hear from you. How do you feel really that security experts can help bridge the gap between what we refer to as the believers and then there's the doubters of climate change? How can we bridge that gap through the security lens?
Well, I'm speaking now from an American perspective, understand. And US society, I don't think I have to explain to people, is deeply polarized along ideological grounds between Republicans and Democrats, left and right. And climate change has been embedded in that ideological divide. So typically, if you're a Democrat, you believe in the science of climate change, and you believe that environmental action is essential to slow the pace of global warming. And if you're a Republican, you don't believe, from an ideological perspective, that is to say, you don't believe in the science of climate change, and you don't think that action on climate change is a priority. It's just the way things have become in this society, and it's terribly unfortunate. And it means that progress on Capitol Hill in Washington has become almost impossible. Bills cannot be moved through Congress. And part of the problem is, as I suggested, is that a large swath of the population will not listen to the scientists on climate change. And so I came to the conclusion that segment of the population would be open to hearing from the military and intelligence community, because typically Republicans are very patriotic, as we all are, but they especially value the military historically, and are more prone to listen to generals and admirals than they may be to environmental scientists. And in fact, senior members of the US military and the intelligence community have been very vocal in recent years about the dangers of climate change to American national security. They've been saying very vocally before Congress and in other statements that if we don't stop climate change, America's security will be at grave danger, at extreme risk. And I think that this message, that climate change is a threat to the nation's security, is a message that those who are non-believers might be willing to hear, that they wouldn't listen to scientists that they would associate with their ideological opponents.
That's very well put. And that's what I see from my experience as well, with working with the Center for Climate and Security and the hosting of this conference, really bringing to the forefront what is going on behind the scenes in the national security and climate communities, because there's been work there for decades. We saw Biden just prioritized as an executive order climate change as a national security priority. And so we're really seeing the tide turn, and this security and climate perspective make its way through the societal discourse more. So it's becoming more mainstream. What do you think about that? So this is not just to reach maybe those doubters, but it's actually becoming a much more mainstream way to talk about climate broadly. And perhaps this can actually permeate through society in a way that's going to be broadly sweeping.
Yes, indeed. And I think one aspect of this that's made a huge difference is the fact that so many of America's military installations are located in coastal areas along the east coast of the United States, in particular, that are highly vulnerable to sea level rise and extreme storm damage. And in recent years, we've had several seasons of severe hurricanes that have done great damage to some of those military installations. And those same installations are often co-located with communities up and down the East Coast, typically represented by Republicans. These are often Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, the places where a lot of military families live, Virginia Beach, I'm thinking of Norfolk, Virginia, that are represented by Republicans, but the communities, like the military installations, have been heavily affected by sea level rise and severe storm damage. And you're beginning to see a kind of a collaboration between military bases and the surrounding communities, because of the bases and the communities are interdependent with one another. People who work on the base live in those communities, and when storms come, they're unable to get to their jobs. So working groups have developed between the communities and the bases, and that's brought many Republican representatives and some senators into this process of viewing climate change as a security risk, both to the military itself and to the communities they represent. And that's helped turn the tide in Congress on this issue, I believe.
Exactly. Thank you so much for sharing that. We're really putting this message forward to not just the American public, but the global collective that we all belong to. So your input is much appreciated. Thank you for sharing, Professor Michael Klare.
It's been a pleasure to help.
Well, thank you again to Professor Michael Klare, and we're really looking forward to having him as a speaker for our upcoming conference on the 18th and 19th. So that'll be a real treat. We'll be getting into that quite a bit more. So I will now return to Paul Stevers. Paul, what else can be done to build broad-based support for large-scale action? Paul, you are on mute. If you don't mind unmuting, please.
My apologies. Thank you, Sweta. Yeah, an additional important way to build broad-based support is to design a transition to a low-carbon economy so it'll benefit everyone. Trillions of dollars are going to be spent, and it should be spent in a way that builds broad-based support. So civil society can play an important role to develop strategies and policies that enable everyone to benefit, and especially the poor and marginalized parts of society. I think, and we're going to be getting into this more on the conference on May 18th about how this can be done and why it should be done. If you're there.
Thank you yes, thank you. So then what can be done on a large scale, a large enough scale to help flatten the warming curve that we're on, to help us be set for a more sustainable future?
Yes, the task is extremely large, but it can be done. There is a lot of technologies and nature-based solutions that can be implemented on a global scale. To provide you with a quick illustration of what can be done, we've prepared this 2-minute video, which I'll play for you now.
We agree with the climate security and intelligence experts that the consequences of climate change are dire if we do not take action on a global scale to mitigate this change. Fortunately, solutions already exist that, if implemented on a global scale, could launch us into a sustainable future for all. There are a wide range of solutions available now, many of which can be grouped into 3 main categories: decarbonization of industry, energy storage, and carbon sequestration. Luckily, there's been massive progress in technology relating to these fields. Many technologies and nature-based solutions are available now and can be implemented on a global scale. Here are some examples. Green hydrogen-related technologies can dramatically reduce carbon emissions in transportation, manufacturing, and shipping industry, since hydrogen does not create any carbon emissions when utilized. For example, now you can purchase long-haul transport and local delivery trucks that are powered on hydrogen. As well, there is now a steel production plant powered by hydrogen. Energy storage technology has been rapidly developing, with the cost of battery storage plummeting in recent years. Based on data published by Bloomberg NEF, the cost of battery storage technology has dropped by 76% since 2012, making the combination of renewables and energy storage more financially viable. This storage can enable a massive increase in renewable power generation, which would eliminate the need for many fossil fuel power plants. This energy storage comes in many forms, including pumped hydro, compressed gas, electrochemical batteries, and thermal storage. As we transition into a low-carbon economy, we can draw down our existing emissions through carbon sequestration through the use of technologies and practices to accelerate natural solutions. Examples of this are rapid tree planting with the use of aerial drones, regenerative agricultural practices, and wetland restoration. A 2020 report by the Rhoda Institute shows that regenerative farming and grazing systems, if achieved globally, would draw down more than 100% of current annual CO2 emissions. Other options include artificial direct air capture, which removes carbon dioxide directly out of the ambient air, and carbon capture storage, which removes carbon dioxide out of the gases emitted from industrial processes. The need for climate change mitigation is urgent. The technology and nature-based solutions are ready, and they need to be implemented immediately, simultaneously, and on a global scale. We need large-scale action for this large-scale problem, and the sooner we start, the smaller the impact on present and future generations. The time to act is now. For more information about solutions that can be implemented on a global scale, visit climatesan.org/CSG.
Thank you for sharing that really powerful video. It really also resonates with "we don't have time." Together, we are the solution to the climate crisis, and it's nothing that we can't confront and find solutions to. Very powerful video. So thank you, Paul. Our next speaker is Robert Baines. Robert is the president and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada, which is one of the co-sponsors of today's event. In his role as president, Robert is tasked with communicating the importance of NATO and the international rules-based order to Canadians. He has been a director of the Canada-Turkey Business Council since 2017 and is the former executive director of the Canada-Albania Business Council and corporate development officer of the NATO Association. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks so much, Sweta. I wanted to just give a brief overview of NATO for our audience, just in case some are not so familiar with it. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded after the Second World War as an organization that helps to maintain peace through strength. We learned a lot of lessons from the Second World War, and one of them is the importance of unity when it comes to strong democratic action. And the governing concept of the alliance is an attack upon one is an attack upon all. This allows the organization to mobilize massive resources to face any problem. And of course, it would make it a perfect instrument to help combat climate change. That is why NATO is so important in taking a look at this problem and how to create some solutions. Just recently, the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, on April 22nd, just stated that climate change is the defining challenge of our generation and a crisis multiplier. Obviously, we've already heard about the rising sea levels and extreme weather, how that will pose a security threat to the safety of NATO members and their allies around the world. As such, the Secretary General declared that NATO must set the gold standard on addressing climate change and its security implications. Remember, this is all about collective action, so you can really start leveraging that with an organization like NATO. Global warming is making the world more dangerous. We've already heard there are many experts and military professionals who have attested to this, and for that reason, it matters to NATO. Through the NATO 2030 initiative, NATO is stepping up its efforts to fight climate change, and the Secretary General expects all NATO leaders to approve a climate action plan. In his latest speech, the Secretary General outlined 3 critical areas for NATO involvement. Number 1, understanding the threat climate change poses to security interests. 2, adapting its military assets and installations to operate in new conditions. And number 3, reducing military emissions. So NATO commits to using its unique capabilities and expertise to understand the effects of climate change first. This will include investing more into research and data analysis to better monitor the changing environment. NATO will also leverage its existing green defense, smart energy, and science and technology initiatives. These investments will allow NATO to better respond to climate-related security threats and take anticipatory action where needed. So the second point, NATO will work to adapt its operational functionality in response to changing environments. The Secretary General committed to an alliance-wide survey of NATO equipment and assets to determine the impact climate change will have on operations. In doing so, NATO will create sustainable technology that will replace older and polluting equipment. Furthermore, NATO will conduct all future military planning and exercises with climate change in mind, including the response to civil and natural disasters, to ensure that NATO forces maintain complete effectiveness. Again, we get this wonderful multiplication effect with NATO, where we've got 30 nations working together on these problems. Finally, NATO's third main goal will be to play a key role in reducing military carbon emissions. The idea of greening our militaries will produce a win-win scenario. Reducing reliance on fossil fuels will lessen the environmental impact of military deployments and improve the operational effectiveness of NATO missions because our allies are less dependent on a commodity resource. Anybody who thinks of logistics and how challenging that can be when it comes to fuel or other commodities know that this can be a very helpful thing for a military. Many NATO members are already stepping up in unique ways, such as using biofuel to power fighter jets instead of conventional fuel, integrating solar panels into soldiers' gear, and planting trees on military bases to offset carbon emissions. That's not a little thing, by the way. In most countries, the militaries are some of the largest operators of cars, or they have the biggest infrastructure, road systems, all that stuff. So when you make changes like this, it's going to have a huge impact. The Secretary General culminated his speech on reducing fossil fuel dependency by encouraging militaries to mirror the success of electric vehicles on civilian streets and integrate them into the military where possible. NATO will continue these efforts to strengthen the alliance through the lens of climate change. In doing so, it will partner with the private sector to share expertise and best practices on addressing the threat of climate change. And at the upcoming NATO summit on June 14th, the Secretary General's commitment is to have a clear political action plan from the member states to reduce military emissions, with the ultimate goal of a net zero carbon footprint by 2050. So I think that gives a pretty good overview that NATO is taking the threat of climate change very seriously. And since half the world's economy and over 1 billion people live in NATO member states, what the alliance does will directly impact the rest of the world. NATO will set the gold standard for understanding, adapting to, and reducing emissions to mitigate the security impacts of climate change in the future. This just goes to show, again, the use of NATO, the utility of it, of having so many people working together on a common goal. And that is the whole basis of the rules-based international order, that non-zero sum idea that by collaborating, we can all win. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Robert. That was very reassuring to hear. If we ever needed alliances, it's now. Thank you for sharing that important message. Our next speaker is Dr. Leif Rosenberger. Dr. Rosenberger is an adjunct scholar at the Modern War Institute at West Point and Director of Education Economics and Security Strategy at Think Renewables Group and co-founder of ClimateSAN. He retired from the US government after 35 years of service in 2016. For his last 20 years in the government, he was chief economist at the US Central Command and the US Pacific Command. Dr. Rosenberger, you and your colleagues have assembled an impressive set of speakers for this upcoming conference. Tell us a little bit about what we can expect to look forward to.
Well, thank you, Sweta, for those kind words. The first thing to remember is that this conference is fast approaching. In fact, it starts 2 weeks from today on Tuesday, the 18th of May, and will also occur on the 19th of May. The first day will provide a global view of the environment, and the second day will focus more on increasing investment for climate action in developing countries. Let me first break this down day by day. The first day of the conference will focus on 4 main areas. We will focus on the scope and current and expected threats to human security around the world. The second main area will be introducing strategies to actually mitigate human security threats. And we will also, the third point will be, we will actually highlight solutions that we can implement on a global scale to mitigate climate change. And the fourth thing we will introduce is some initiatives for financing climate action on a global scale. As I mentioned earlier, in the second day, we will focus on increasing investment for climate action in developing countries. This will include an event at noon to reduce investment risks that could arguably increase the scale of private financing. And robust financing would in turn help us to adapt with resiliency and preparedness and help mitigate climate change in Africa. Thank you.
Apologies. Trying to find that mute button is always tricky despite a year of everybody being virtual. Thank you very much, Dr. Rosenberger. We're really looking forward to this upcoming conference on the 18th and 19th. Thank you to all of our speakers today. The purpose of this was really to get us fired up for what's coming up ahead. And I think many of you agree on the need for action on climate change. Looking at climate change through the perspective of human security underscores just how urgent the risk is and how there's a need to do more and to do it quickly. So to that end, if you haven't already, I want to encourage everyone to please register for the upcoming online conference, Impacts of Climate Change on Human Security, What Can Be Done? It's going to be running on May 18th and 19th, a totally free conference to register for, and we're going to examine this topic in greater detail while highlighting strategies and technologies that can facilitate action on a large scale. ClimateSAN, the NATO Association of Canada, and the Modern War Institute at West Point will all be co-sponsors of this event. We have an amazing lineup of speakers, and I encourage you all to attend. So for more information, please visit csc.climatesan.org. So now we're coming up to the Q&A portion of this media advisory event, and we're going to open up for your questions. So if you haven't already done so, please pose a question to one of our speakers. Type in your question into the chat, again, along with your name, your organization, and the speaker you would like to address your question to, or if it's more than one, please indicate that as well. In the interest of time, we ask that each speaker please keep their response to 2 to 3 minutes each. And we have roughly now about 20 plus minutes for Q&A, and we'll do our best to get through all of the questions, time permitting. So we do have some questions that have come in, and this will be directed to Paul. So Canada has a large extractive resource center, which is essential to Canada's economic growth and could fund security initiatives. Is it Canada's national self-interest to care about climate change? How do we reconcile these two?
Well, certainly, I think, Canada has a lot of interest in countering climate change and also benefiting from the transition. Okay, we have huge amounts of resources, but also think that that there's a lot of new technologies coming down the line. One that I was particularly impressed with at the Hydrogen Business Council conference we co-hosted last year was a company called Proton Technologies. And what they have developed is a way of extracting hydrogen from a spent oil and gas field, and leave the CO2 in the ground. And they can do this at dramatically lower prices. So they talk about being able to produce hundreds of tons per day of hydrogen at around 50 cents per kilogram. And that compares to making it from natural gas at around $1.80 per kilogram, or making it from green hydrogen, which is sometimes in the range of $3 to $4 per kilogram. So the idea is that there's ways to do it. Now you're going to be able to employ a lot of people doing that and really transitioning and to a green economy. So and at the same time, we have huge areas where we can employ nature-based solutions like rapid reforestation with drones, and also change the way we do agriculture so we sequester more carbon. But Canada could really become a leader in sequestering carbon and producing energy and goods in a low carbon economy.
I'm just going to follow up with you on that, because since you mentioned hydrogen, another question from the audience is, hydrogen must be green. Can you talk about that a little bit more? And how do we produce hydrogen so it's not from gas and so it doesn't continue to contribute to emissions?
Yes, that the hydrogen, most of the hydrogen in the world right now, I think more than 90%, if not more than 95%, is produced from natural gas using steam reforming technology. And it's my understanding is that it's so much that's like about similar to the emissions of all of Indonesia, is what I was reading at one point. So this has to change in a big way. And as I mentioned, Proton has one technology. Another company that we've been in discussions with, they've got a new reforming technique that would sequester about 90% of the carbon that is generated from the hydrogen, which could be a good transition technology. So, but I do believe we have to move to green hydrogen. Oh, and there's another one. We have a huge in British Columbia. We have a very huge wind resource, and there's a company there, Hydrogen Canada, that's going to be putting in a massive wind farm to produce hydrogen for export. So, and they plan to do it at a considerably lower price than the current cost of producing hydrogen from a small green location. And another thing that we can do is that surplus electricity in Ontario that is sometimes used to heat Lake Ontario, instead of doing that, that can be used to make hydrogen and power trucks and vehicles. And we're in discussions with people about an Ontario Hydrogen Partnership to actually get this on the go.
Fantastic. There's a lot of promise in these technologies. Thank you for clarifying the role of hydrogen going forward. I have the next question here for Leif. So Leif, tell us a little bit more about the International Military Council on Climate and Security. I was actually present at the Planetary Security Initiative conference in The Hague back in 2019, and that was when it was launched by the Honorable Sherry Goodman and General Middendorp. And they will both be at the conference in a couple of weeks. So it's actually very exciting that we will have the founders of IMC-CS there. But let's give our audience a little bit of information on what this is and what this means going forward for really creating these alliances at this global level.
Oh, yes, thank you very much for that. The International Military Council on Climate and Security has produced a number of publications which I think the media should be aware of, and if they have an opportunity to read through a number of them. One of which is the World Climate and Security Report 2020. And we have actually a panel that's going to be discussing this, led by General Tom Middendorf, who is the chair of the council. And he has a number of experts that will be there looking at this from a regional standpoint, from the South Asia standpoint, Southeast Asia, Brazil, Indo-Asia. In other words, they've done a global look, and then they've drilled down into more specific applications in different regions of the world. And one area that I'm, both Mark Reed, who will be on one of the panels, the West Point panel that I'm moderating, he and I are both written on Syria, and we will be addressing that as well. And one interesting thing is the day before the Syrian civil war, the folks inside the Beltway were saying Syria was stable and immune from Arab Spring. And the next day, the Syrian civil war began. So one of the things we've learned from all this is you can't just look at military indicators or even political indicators. You have to look at a combination of climate change and gross mismanagement of agriculture in many of these areas like Syria and the Sahel. And we know from our experience in looking at all this at CENTCOM, where I worked for almost 10 years, is that agricultural malpractice combines with climate change. And places like Israel have resiliency programs to reduce the impact of climate change. But places like Syria do not. And this turns into extreme drought, food insecurity, migration, social unrest, and political protest, and ultimately military conflict. So one of the things we have done is begin to take a look at these lessons learned from places like Syria and try to avoid this same pattern in Africa, Sahel being one example. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. We have a couple of tough questions coming in from the audience for NATO. And so I will direct this at you, Robert, and also please, David. What we're looking to understand is, where does NATO fit in to IMCCS? That's the first question. And then NATO was formed on this assumption that there's an enemy, but climate change isn't necessarily an enemy. So is NATO as a solution appropriate? Does it make sense to put more military expenditure in as opposed to actually reducing it, given how we have limited resources and need to prioritize? Please, your thoughts on this, Robert.
Sure thing. Well, I'm afraid I can't really comment from personal experience on the IMCCS, where exactly it fits in, but I do know that, for the past year, NATO has been going aggressively into the climate change debate, if you will, or discussion about how important it is to the alliance as a whole. And they've just gone full throttle into it. The Secretary General of NATO, of course, was previously a Deputy Minister of the Environment, and he was also a UN envoy for the environment. So he has it very close to his heart and the importance of it to NATO. As to its applicability, NATO is defined by not what is against them. It's about what unites the countries. So one of the discussions we often have is a lot of people talk about NATO existing only to respond to the USSR back in the day. But in reality, it's anything that may be a threat to the alliance can unite it. If there was an alien invasion, NATO would be the tool that could be put against it. If there is a zombie apocalypse, NATO could do the job to unite people against it. It's anything that is against NATO draws the countries together. And in this case, it's just a clear threat to the members of the alliance in so many different ways. The different conflicts that are coming to embroil on the outskirts of the alliance, North Africa, the Middle East. There are a lot of different areas that are really directly in the area of interest for NATO. So I don't see it as any stretch of the imagination that NATO should be seeing this as one of its major threats that it sees down the road. And also just to make sure that people understand that it is a political and military alliance, one that is geared towards making sure that peace, prosperity, and security reign. It's a wonderfully flexible alliance, which makes it a perfect tool for all sorts of things that it was never envisioned to be a tool for. That's its real genius. It is flexible enough to be used definitely in this situation.
Thank you for clarifying that. David, I'd love your thoughts on this if you would like to share.
Well, look, I totally agree with what Robert has said. It's obvious, if climate pressures are such a great calamity on a particular country, it will affect the outward posture of that country towards its neighbors. And that alone could create a threat. So as Robert said, NATO is a defensive alliance. It's to keep us secure from whatever threat, but the threat could be precipitated by a country on the North Atlantic Alliance because of climate pressures within that particular country. The need to act and to hit out at others to solve your own issues that have been exacerbated by climate change.
Leif, I'd love for you to pick up on that since we started talking about IMCCS with you more broadly. And thank you for that insight on NATO. This is absolutely fascinating. I know the audience is really going to be in for a treat for this conference coming up as we get into more detail and we actually have conversations with those who are leading the charge across these various organizations and alliances. But But how do we think, Lee, from your point of view, that international relations, relationships, alliances broadly are going to change, such as what we're seeing with IMCCS, because of climate change and because of clean energy transformations? Are we talking about a new international relations landscape altogether?
Certainly not. There's still going to be, international relations consists of conflict as well as cooperation. One of the things that disturbs me is how both the Republicans and the Democrats are both bashing China. And like it or not, China is very important. If we're going to avoid a nuclear war, we have to work with China and try to influence North Korea to eliminate their nuclear weapons. The same thing with Iran. But the good news is that I think that climate change is a threat to the planet. We want to save the planet, including the United States and China. We have common ground, and we can begin a dialogue with China and with Russia. And maybe the fact that Rex Tillerson worked at Exxon Mobil, like it or not, we might be able to use him as a presidential envoy to talk to Putin and to try to convince him that the Arctic, which is warming and will be an immediate threat to both the United States and Canada, should be an area of cooperation rather than conflict. And the good news is Putin has to go to ExxonMobil and the US oil companies because we have the best technology in the world. So we can use that as leverage for helping Putin with his energy needs. But hopefully we can begin to move that in the direction of green energy rather than just fossil fuels.
So as we think about how we're going to be working together with the military, and we know that the military has not just the national security threat, but with some of the highest energy needs of any organization in the world, what we'll be looking to the military to signal how these changes actually then resonate throughout the rest of society. What can we expect and hold the military accountable for, especially when it comes to carbon emissions from the military? This question is, please, for anyone who would like to take it, but how do we especially count, let's say, carbon emissions from military operations like flights? And are they exempt from being counted? How do we hold them accountable?
Well, I think if you've looked at what I was the mentor and professor of Lloyd Austin when he was a student of mine at the Army War College. And he has recently now, of course, I worked for him at CENTCOM and now he's Secretary of Defense. And he is very conscious of the fact that climate change is a threat to the world, and especially to US military operations. And he has made statements to that effect. So I think this is a big change from what we saw in the past. Frankly, if you go back, even in the Obama administration, I don't think you would have seen this kind of focus as you do now. And certainly we lost 4 years with the Trump administration calling climate change a hoax. But the good news is that General Lloyd Austin and President Biden, I think, are working closely together. And our General Austin is doing everything he can to make sure that the military takes the lead, and it's trying to convince people who are more conservative bent that Michael Klare had talked about earlier, begin to see the reality. If we're going to have a strong military, it has to be a military that is not only talking a good talk about countering climate change, but is actually taking action. And actually, if you go back to the days of Admiral Roughhead, he moved when he was the CNO, he actually moved towards countering climate change in a lot of the warships. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but we have, frankly, a big mountain to climb when both the Republicans and the Democrats are bashing China. I think we have to think twice about that and find ways to cooperate with China and Russia.
Thank you, Leif. Picking up on that thread, I'd love to direct this to Robert. Same sort of question, same idea. Let's say we're talking now about greening militaries ultimately. As much as the military is leading the charge and will have major impact in terms of how we overhaul energy needs, there's still serious energy needs. And so if we're greening militaries, are we putting militaries at risk? Is it ultimately a contradiction for military to be able to go green?
Well, I think that's a very good question, Sweta. I mean, ultimately, NATO is quite good at logistics, and we can walk and chew gum at the same time. There's no question that there are always issues that could affect the operation of military equipment that just in some cases we cannot, for safety's sake, have solar panels on everything and give up fossil fuels, et cetera, in every single case. However, at the same time, I am very cheered by the fact that NATO is taking so much effort to measure. You'll notice that they were talking a lot about getting data. And I think that's really the key here, to make sure that there is that balance. And the only way we can do that is by testing, by investigating. And also just the ability to measure then allows you to create standards. I was talking about the kind of gold standard that they want to set at NATO headquarters. This is all one of the wonderful attributes of NATO is there's this thing called interoperability, which means that every country has to be measurable in the same way and that their equipment has to work with one another. That means that when you start creating these standards, they have a much wider impact and you can leverage them in a much greater way. And I just think that once you start measuring, then you can audit. Then you can say, well, what is the standard we want to reach? And it'll most likely be a voluntary standard, but voluntary standards have worked in many different areas of NATO. And NATO does have a lot of experience auditing different countries' contributions. So that's what I'd say.
Please, Leif.
Yeah, let me just discuss this in a little more depth. When it comes to, a lot of people say this is just General Austin talking about climate change and he's not actually going to do much. My experience is that things have already started to move when it comes to war planning. And that gets to the heart of your question. And that is in war planning, in phase 0, we have what's called shaping the environment. And a lot of people in the past thought of that as simply shaping the political environment. But now increasingly it is shaping the environment and countering climate change to avert conflict, as I mentioned earlier with Syria. We don't want to see another Syria happening in other parts of the world. So we have to be focused on phase 0 more than ever. Phase 1 and 2 are the actual operations, and you heard Michael Klare talking about this already, that when it comes to naval bases, they're threatened by the rise in sea level. They can't do operations when their naval bases are covered with water. So that's another thing to think about. But increasingly, the thing that I think is most important is after wars, civil wars in different parts of the world, the US military has war plans for what we call phases 3 and 4, and that is stabilization and reconstruction. And in the past, this was just talking about, a power plant was destroyed, we'll just build another fossil fuel power plant. No, in the future, we're gonna focus on what countries like Morocco have done, where almost 50% of their energy now comes from solar power. And there's no reason why our stabilization and reconstruction plans can't do the same thing. And you, Sweta, have been world class when it comes to talking about resiliency and preparedness. And that is going to be part of phase 3 and 4 of war plans from now on.
Very well put. Thank you for sharing that. David, coming to you, same question on NATO or the military alliances more broadly. Greening militaries will be a game changer. How do you see that actually transpiring? What is your hope for seeing that happen? And what is the timeline in your opinion?
Well, I agree with Robert and Leif in their remarks, but one point I would like to make is that people view the military as something that they almost can't comprehend, the military thrust, the military power, and of course it is quite extraordinary. But just think for a moment of what is happening in the greening of, say, transportation. Both Boeing and Airbus are developing passenger planes that will run on hydrogen fuel. We see electric cars, electric buses, electric trains, and other modes of transportation. So, the military is an operation that depends on the powering of ships, of planes, of mobile equipment, land-based equipment. And even the power to generate shots from armaments and that type of thing. And so all of that is like transportation is being rethought. And so I think this whole discussion, though, is one of urgency. I think that's one thing that has come very clear in the presentations this morning, and I think more and more people around the world are realizing as they see storms and disasters and what has occurred, how their daily lives are being disrupted, that climate change is real. And climate change has to be faced by all manner of organizations and all aspects of the economy.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We're going to be really getting into all of this and so much more on May 18th and 19th. So if you haven't registered, I'm directing your attention to do that one more time. This is just the tip of the iceberg of the discussions that we're getting into. And before I come to the panelists for some final thoughts on really the role of the military in reaching that goal, that ambitious goal of net neutral across countries by 2050, I'll go in turn across the panelists and just get your final thoughts on that. But before we do that, Paul, so many questions have been coming to you from the audience. With Klare, you have clear, deep expertise in science and innovation and the role of technology in terms of reaching our goals in the future. And so you've already talked about hydrogen. You can't really talk about hydrogen without thinking about nuclear. So can you talk a little bit about science and technology and specifically the role of nuclear in reaching net zero ambitions by 2050?
There's quite a wide opinion about nuclear, but I would say that at the very least, that the nuclear plants that we have now should not be heating the water when the electricity is not needed. They should be making hydrogen from that, and then we should be using that hydrogen. Now, I think that over time, certain nuclear technologies have gotten safer, but we also have to be concerned about terrorism risk. Okay, with nuclear waste. So that's almost like a bigger discussion that I would like to have, but that certainly if we have existing plants that are running, let's not waste electricity. Let's use what we can and reduce the fossil fuel usage right now, and then come on the 18th and 19th, we can discuss this more.
We absolutely will. One more time to remind participants, thank you so much for joining us here for this media advisory event. It's really a teaser for what's to come. The conference is May 18th and 19th on the impacts of climate change on human security. What can be done? Please visit csc.climatesan.org and you can register there for free. This is going to be access and information to some of the greatest minds in climate and security, and it's one not to be missed. We really look forward to seeing you on the 18th and 19th for this virtual conference. And with that, let's take some final thoughts from our incredible panelists here today. Out of respect for time, we are ending. I know the military respects time, and so we are ending roughly on time, but would love your final thoughts on the relationship that the military can play in ensuring that we reach our net neutral targets and ambitions by 2050. So Leif, if we could please start with you, and then we'll go to David, Robert, and end with Paul.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a quick preview. We'll have a number of panels that will be discussing all of this, but I will be chairing and moderating a panel filled with West Point professors, and they will be led by the chairman of the Department of Environmental Engineering and Geography at West Point, Mark Reed. And that panel will be called Educating America's Future Military Leaders. So I think West Point is taking the lead in this. I think in the past, they had to be very careful not to promote ways to mitigate climate change when President Trump was in office, because the military is apolitical. But Mark tells me that no matter what, they address this as a science, not as hearsay. And so I'm delighted that we have a panel that will be discussing how they're educating their military leaders to be sensitive on all this from the standpoint of human security. As I mentioned earlier, they're addressing the threats, they're addressing strategies to mitigate these threats to human security. They're coming up with actual shovel-ready solutions to implement, and also looking at exploring ways to finance all of this and reduce the risk to investment. The other panel that I'm looking forward to chairing is one on recommendations for the Biden administration. Once again, the U.S. military is not holding back this time because of Donald Trump saying all this is a hoax. They are leading the way, and I will be addressing how General Austin is doing this in a lot of his publications already. And we're pleased to have people like John Conger and others who are members of the Center for Climate and Security, who were part of the administration before Donald Trump arrived on the scene. And I think thanks to these folks and the work they have done in producing the World Climate and Security Report 2020, they're leading the way. They're not following.
Excellent points. Thank you, Leif. David, please, on to you.
Well, Sweta, in the interest of time, I think I should defer to our exceptional colleague and president of the NATO Association, Robert Baines, because I think that he will sum this very incredible discussion in very well.
Please, Robert, on to you.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I think just the one point that I'd like to leave everybody with is the speed with which things can start moving. I am really bowled over by the Secretary General's ability to navigate the seriousness of this challenge and make sure that it's clear among all 30 NATO nations. You have to remember, NATO is an organization that's based on consensus. Everybody has to agree. And the ability that he's had to kind of steer that forward shows real vision, and it gives me great hope. When so many people are kind of despairing at the size of this challenge, we have here a very useful tool, a very powerful tool that is now bending its effort towards this goal to combat climate change and to come to carbon net zero by 2050. So I'm just really impressed by it, and I hope you'll all join us in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you, Robert. That passion is infectious, and I mean that in a positive way, not the COVID-19 way. Thank you for sharing that. Paul, the floor is yours. Please, your final words.
Very well, thank you. Yeah, so from my research, the situation, the trend we're on is disastrous, but there's technologies and nature-based solutions and the money available to do it. But we need really broad-based support to make this happen. And I think that it's very critical that organizations that are concerned about this, that also share information about what the military intelligence communities are talking about, because this, I think, can help build broad-based support from the people who are hoping that somebody else takes care of the problem or fully just denying this. So the views of theirs is very critical that we get that view out into the mainstream media, and then as well, as we're moving forward for a large-scale transition, it has to be done in a way that everybody benefits. And so that's, I think, a key role for civil society to involve and to develop policies and strategies and programs to get this done. And if we can do that, we can look forward to a very positive future. Thank you.
I'm sorry if I froze for a second there. Apologies. Something funny just happened with my internet. Okay. Everybody's moving, so we're back in real time. Okay, thank you so much, Paul. We're closing. I'm glad that happened right at the end. So thank you everyone so much for joining today. Robert, Paul, Leif, David, it was a real treat. Again, we're really just at the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we are going to be exploring and discussing. We're sharing ideas, we're scaling solutions. This is how together we are going to collaborate and confront and overcome the climate crisis. So appreciate your time, gentlemen, and the work that you have done and will continue to do. So much appreciated. And to the audience members, thank you for staying and engaging. Please do register for free at csc.climatesan.org. And today you have joined us for a special media advisory event ahead of this upcoming online conference, Impacts of Climate Change on Human Security, What Can Be Done. We really look forward to seeing you then, and please join us and get excited. This is something we can definitely overcome together. Thank you again, gentlemen. Thank you, audience.